The lessons of this history continue to be relevant as anti-Semitism still remains a threat, just as we witnessed at the Texas synagogue this month. We thank you for joining us today evening to commemorate International Holocaust Remembrance Day. This program is inspired by the searing documentary Final Account, a 2020 film directed and produced by Luke Holland. Mr. Holland died shortly after post-production was completed on June 10, 2020. Final Account weaves together interviews with the last living generation of people who participated in Hitler's Third Reich. You will see clips from this documentary, followed by a moderated conversation featuring survivors and children of Holocaust survivors. Just a few housekeeping rules. The chat feature should be used for comments, and then the Q&A for questions, either to the panelists or the moderator. Today's program would not have been possible without the support of three distinct organizations: the Jewish Historical Society of Fairfield County, Holocaust and Human Rights Education Center, and the United Jewish Federation of Stamford, New Canaan, and Darien. We are immensely grateful for all that they have done to bring this program to fruition. They will now say a few words, starting with Peter Lilienthal of the Jewish Historical Society of Fairfield County. Peter?
Thank you, Elizabeth, and for the program sponsored by the Ferguson Library today. It's a pleasure to be a partner with the United Jewish Federation of Stamford, New Canaan, and Darien, and the Holocaust and Human Rights Education Center. As you mentioned, today, January 27th, is Holocaust Remembrance Day, commemorating the 1945 liberation of Auschwitz-Buchenwald, 77 years ago. It's a very concerning time, with the unprecedented rise in anti-Semitism that makes this and other programs essential to the ongoing Holocaust education requirement. I look forward to the discussion of the movie Final Account by this well-qualified and distinguished panel. Thank you very much, Elizabeth, and take care.
Good evening. I'm Sharon Lewis, Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council, or the Jcrc. For those of you who might not know, the Jcrc is the public affairs arm of United Jewish Federation of Stamford, New Canaan, and Darien. Part of Jcrc's mission is to engage in nonpartisan work focused on education, advocacy, social justice, communal security, support for Israel, and combating anti-Semitism. As we've said already, the Holocaust began 80 years ago. The lessons of history have never been more relevant. Anti-Semitism is often called the oldest hatred, and unfortunately, incidents of anti-Semitism have risen in the United States in recent years. Most recently and significantly, of course, in the recent terrorist attack on the synagogue in Texas. We are honored to be participating tonight and thank the Ferguson Library for asking us to be a co-sponsor of the event. We're privileged to be co-sponsors with the Jewish Historical Society of Fairfield County and the Holocaust and Human Rights Education Center. We want to thank and very much the panelists who have agreed to participate in this. I know that your insights and comments on the film will be so worthwhile. If you have any questions at all or would like more information about the Jewish Community Relations Council, please feel free to contact me at United Jewish Federation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for sponsoring, and thank you for the Ferguson Library. My name is Michael Jcrc. I'm chairman of the Holocaust and Human Rights Education Center. Our mission is to use the lessons of the Holocaust to teach about the unimaginable toll of human hatred. We are a speakers bureau. In fact, I'm very happy to say that Judith Altman and Andy Sarkini, who you'll hear from later, are both members of our speaker bureau. We speak in many schools and many educational formats. We also have programs that we teach to elementary, middle, and high school students about the toll of hatred and try to educate people on how to be upstanders, not bystanders. I myself, Peter actually, I'm sorry, Andy Sharakini, who you'll hear from later, actually grew up in the same city as my parents. I'm the son of 2 Holocaust survivors, both Hungarian survivors. My mother was an inmate in Auschwitz back in 1945. All 4 of my grandparents were killed in concentration camps. My father was in forced labor camp. These things are not so far away. They're just a generation away from us. And as we know, anti-Semitism is loud and strong and can continue unless we educate. So that is our goal. I thank everybody for being here. I won't hold it up anymore. Let's get going with this wonderful program. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Michael, Peter, and Sharon. And now what we are going to be doing is watching clips from the documentary Final Account.
So now we get to see it again.
Besetzt bin ich gegangen, weil ich gesehen habe, gehört habe, geschrieben habe, harte Erziehung, ich war Sportler. Leichtathletik, Ringen, Boxen, Fußball spielen, Berggehen. Besetzt bin ich gegangen, weil ich gesehen habe, gehört habe, geschrieben habe, harte Erziehung, ich war Sportler. Leichtathletik, Ringen, Boxen, Fußball spielen, Berggehen, Skifahren. Ich war für Sport, ich war für Härte.
Hier sind meine Eltern mit mir zu einer Berufsberatung gegangen. Und da sagte der Mann, ja, er muss erst Arbeitsdienst und die Wehrmacht ablegen. Das sind 2,5 Jahre. Oder aber sagt er, sie schicken ihn hierhin, nach Oranienburg, in die Totenkopfverband. Der nimmt mit 16 und der Arbeitsdienst fällt dort weg. Wir haben einmal einen Mann gesehen. Ich sage, du, den kenne ich, der hat mir mal Briefmarken abgekauft von der deutschen Nothilfe und wollte hingehen. Der hat doch nichts Böses getan. Da hält ein Kamerad mich fest und sagt, du Idiot, hast du noch nicht gemerkt, was hier gespielt wird? War ein Herr Warschauer.
Warum hat man ihn nach Schaffhausen geschleppt?
Das kann ich Ihnen nicht sagen. Wahrscheinlich war zu viel, dass er Jude war. Ja? Dass eine Schweinerei war, dass man den Mann einsperrt hat. Da waren wir nicht mit einverstanden. Das können Sie sich denken. Aber in der Mühle, da halten Sie den Mund mit 16. Tut mir leid. Das muss ich Ihnen sagen. Und dann hörte ich draußen Schreie. Und also Tisch unter das Bett, unter das Fenster gestellt und noch ein Schemel oben drauf, dass ich rausgucken konnte oben aus dem vergitterten Fenster. Und dann sah ich Menschen geschlagen und Ochsenzüge. Und andere hingen mit auf dem Rücken zusammengebundenen Händen. Dann nahm man unten einen Schimmel weg und dann schrien die, bis sie bewusstlos waren.
Wenn ein Offizier das von ihm verlangt hätte.
Wenn ein Offizier von mir verlangt hätte, den Stuhl wegzunehmen, dann wäre der Stuhl geflogen. Ist doch klar. Zumindest sind wir mitschuldig an der Täterschaft anderer. Ja? Aktive Täterschaft kann man uns nicht nachweisen. Das haben wir nicht getan. Wir haben keinen anderen Menschen geschlagen, eingesperrt oder sonst gleich getan. Aber wir haben es hingenommen.
Wie können Sie behaupten, dass Sie einen anderen Menschen nicht eingesperrt haben, wenn Sie als Wachtmann mit der SS
Eine berechtigte Frage. Eine sehr berechtigte Frage. Da fängt die Mitschuld an, schuld zu werden. Deswegen bin ich ja raus.
Aber wann bekommt die Mitschuld eigentlich Täterschaft?
Die Mitschuld beginnt ja eigentlich schon mit dem dorthin gekommen, nicht gleich Geld gemacht zu haben. Das haben wir nicht gewagt. Ja, alle blieben stehen. Zumindest sind wir mitschuldig an der Täterschaft anderer. Ja? Aktive Täterschaft kann man uns nicht nachweisen. Das haben wir nicht getan. Wir haben keinen anderen Menschen geschlagen, eingesperrt oder sonst gleich getan. Aber wir haben es hingenommen.
Wie können Sie behaupten, dass Sie einen anderen Menschen nicht eingesperrt haben, wenn Sie als Wachtmann Mitglied der SS
Eine berechtigte Frage. Eine sehr berechtigte Frage. Da fängt die Mitschuld an, schuld zu werden. Deswegen bin ich ja raus.
Aber wann bekommt die Mitschuld eigentlich Täterschaft?
Die Mitschuld beginnt ja eigentlich schon mit dem dorthin gekommen zu sein. Nicht gleich Geld gemacht zu haben. Das haben wir nicht gewagt. Ja, alle blieben stehen.
Nehmen wir mal an, es gab ein Kommando zur Judenvernichtung. Wenn ich dort als Polizist oder als Soldat, ist jetzt wurscht, gezwungen bin, mitzuhelfen, die Juden, nehmen wir mal an, einzusammeln und ins KZ zu bringen. Was bin ich da? Wenn ich freiwillig gehe, bin ich sicher ein Täter. Wenn mir befohlen wird, du musst es machen, beginnt da bereits die Täterschaft. Wenn ich sage, Juden los, weiter, ich weiß es nicht, ich kann die Frage nicht beantworten. Weil was soll ich tun? Wenn ich sage, ich mache nicht, dann sagen sie, dann stellen wir dich auch an die Wand.
Kennen Sie Fälle, wo derjenige, der Nein sagt, an die Wand gestellt wird?
Nein, ich kenne keinen Fall.
In der Literatur scheinbar gibt es auch keinen Fall.
Nein, ich kenne keinen Fall.
Und hätten Sie so einen Befehl bekommen, was hätten Sie in dieser Lage gemacht?
Ja, das ist eine Frage. Vielleicht hätte mich, wenn 99 vor mir Ja sagen, vielleicht hätte ich dann auch mitgemacht.
Die Hauptschuld für das Massenmord der Juden im Zweiten Weltkrieg.
Im Zweiten Weltkrieg bleibt bei den Deutschen, das ist ihr Makel, das sie lebelang immer wieder tragen müssen. Aber ich fühle mich nicht in die Massivschuld der Deutschen eingezwängt.
Wer hat die Schuld?
Das wird Gott richten. Das wird Gott richten.
Lassen Sie den lieben Gott beiseite.
Nee, ich lasse.
Ja, Ihre Meinung haben. Der liebe Gott sitzt mir nicht gegenüber.
Nein, aber meine Meinung.
Ich kann Ihnen nicht die Frage stellen. Das heißt, also,
nein.
Sie, ja.
Aber ich fühle mich schäme mich als Deutsche. Weil im deutschen Namen so als das Grausames passiert ist. Mit dieser Akribie, mit dieser buchhalterischen Genauigkeit.
Bei der Beurteilung, wenn man die aburteilt, würde ich schon unterscheiden zwischen denen, die es gemacht haben und die aber Täter waren, sage. Täter waren, sage.
War der KZ-Wachtmann, war er auch für Sie ein Täter?
Ja, also ich gehörte ja auch dazu. Ich fühle mich als Täter.
Ich sage immer, wir haben das nicht gewusst, aber Täter sind wir ja auch. Wir haben das ja zugelassen. Wir hätten die Sache auf den Grund gehen müssen. So sind wir im Nachhinein doch auch Täter.
Ob ich nun mich als Täter bezeichne? Das ist so eine globale Frage. Ich wäre nicht Täter gewesen, wenn ich an irgendeiner Stelle den Mut und die Courage bewiesen hätte, zu sagen, nein. Nun kann man sagen, wenn ich das nicht gehabt habe, dann bin ich auch Täter. Das ist natürlich eine einfache Antwort. Wobei ich natürlich als Täter dann nicht verurteilt werden kann, denn ich bin ja ein Täter, ich bin ja im Grunde ein geistiger Täter gewesen und kein. Aber ich würde sagen, lassen Sie uns mal langsam Schluss machen. Ja.
Sind alle 5 Gebürtige Ebenseer? Ist das richtig?
Alle Gebürtige Ebenseer.
Was haben Sie kriegsüber eigentlich vom KZ mitgekriegt? Wie viel hat man davon eigentlich gewusst?
Ja, gewusst haben wir gar nichts genau. Also ich weiß nicht, ob es die anderen gewusst haben. Ich habe gar nichts genau gewusst, weil bei Glödelscheiß ist alles verduscht worden, nicht? Das von den KZ. Verstehst du mich? Nicht, da haben sie alles niederduscht, nicht niedergehalten. So unter der Hand, wissen Sie, so haben sie gekriegt, nicht? Sie haben gesprochen, aber laut nicht. Nein, laut nicht.
Ja, es war furchtbar. Ne?
Es war furchtbar.
Ja, mein Opa, den ich jetzt noch habe, jetzt ist er auch noch gefallen. Der hat so viel erzählt, weil er im KZ war und überlebt. Ja, oder überlebt.
Hunger haben sie
eine Zeit lang. Und so viel verhungert sind, nicht?
Die KZler haben in den Stollen gearbeitet.
Die wollten noch keiner haben.
No.
Wie oft haben sie so einen Horntragen mit der Trage, nicht? Weil er nicht mehr Kinder hat. Naja, das ist oft mit. Die haben nicht mehr Kinder, nichts zu messen.
Ja, aber nun so viel. Und
das war halt Wein, nicht? Ja.
Und was ist dann geschehen mit denjenigen, die nicht mehr konnten, die nicht mehr arbeiten konnten?
Verbrennt sind worden.
Ja, genau.
Hat der Ofen brennt. Ja, da hat man schon gesehen, wenn das so geraucht hat, der Ofen, da hat man schon gewusst. Ja, das waren Zeiten. Ja, Kirchezeiten. Ja.
Vielleicht haben sie geschlagen, bis das nicht mehr Kinder. Das war ja so weit runtergeflogen, das Leid geschlagen, bis das nicht mehr Kinder.
Ja, dann war es immer.
Ja, genau.
Sie meinen also, dass die Leute hier im Dorf eigentlich gewusst haben, was da oben losging? Oder was ist Ihre Meinung?
aber heimlich. Es hat sich niemand getraut, vor Angst, dass man auch dahin kommt. Haben ja alle gesagt, sag ja nichts, sonst bist du auch im KZ. Das nimmt ja nicht schon, aber nicht so. Und einen Tag bevor damit gekommen sind, da hat es unheimlich geraucht und gestunken und da haben sie alle noch verbrennt, die ganz halt fertig gewesen sind, haben sie alle verbrennt.
Ja, ich sage, ich bin meistens bei dem Fenster gewesen, nicht?
Ja.
Aber wo ich gesehen, nicht?
Ja, ja.
Ist der Jeep aufgefahren.
Ja.
Nicht? Mit den Armen.
Ja.
Ja, die haben es du aufgemacht. Kannst du den Jubel vorstellen, wie die runtergekommen sind?
Wie die geschrien haben.
Wie die geschrien haben. Und wo lauter Freude. Was? Das war ein Freudenschrei. So gefreut haben das sie.
Ja.
Nicht? Und dann haben unsere Leute da gemacht, die da nicht, was die brechen ein und lauter so Sachen, was die wissen.
Ja.
Aber von denen gar keine Spur.
Ja.
Und auf einmal sind die von der SS, die was zuerst da überall alles bewacht haben und die haben alle verschwunden. Du hast keinen mehr gesehen.
Auf einmal hat es Glocken geklingelt, nicht? Und es war so wie Nacht schon, nicht? Dann kämen wir bei der Nacht, haben wir den ganzen Kosten ausgeworfen, nicht überall geschaut.
Aber jemand war da, ne? Nicht Frau, ihr Freund, kann man sagen.
Mein Freund, er war bei der SS, nicht? Und da hätten sie ja
knapp.
Der war nicht gar im See.
Nein, mein Mann war drin.
Ach so.
Dein Mann, ist der Nazi gewesen? Ihr Mann war SS-Mann.
Ja.
Der war ein Wächter im Lager.
Ja, weil er nicht nein Mann nicht versteckt hätte. Versteckt hätte. Hätten sie ihn auch geholt. Ja. Aber den haben sie nicht erwischt.
Ja.
That's a pretty fun shit. That's a great lead.
Sagten, Sie schämen sich jetzt dafür, dass Sie Deutschland dafür. Habe ich das so richtig verstanden?
Nein, habe ich nicht gesagt. Ich schäme mich heute, dass ich diesem Orden beigetreten bin und stolz war, in der Leibstandarte zu gehen und stolz war, dieses Zeichen zu tragen. Und unser Führer, der Held, hat sich Pfeile im Bunker verkrochen und hat sich erschossen und der Verantwortung entzogen. Und dieser Adolf und seine Clique haben uns Unglück gebracht. Die haben dazu geführt, dass wir unsere Heimat verloren haben. Und die Ehre habe ich verloren.
Und was?
Die Ehre.
Aber Sie waren doch damals auch voll mit Ehre und Stolz. Wenn
Was war?
Sie Ihre beibehalten hätten, dann schämen Sie sich jetzt dafür, dass Sie damals die Ehre hatten, für Ihr Vaterland zu stehen? Das verstehe ich nicht. Ich schäme sich nur dafür, dass es...
Ich schäme mich für die Verbrechen, die begangen wurden. Fürs Vaterland einzustellen, war das ganz was anderes.
Alle sagen ja, du weißt, wenn wir auf Kamera hatten, sagen die ja, dann bin ich dann
Überleg doch mal. Die Mehrheit hat geklatscht, als sie London und Coventry in Schutt und Asche gelegt haben. Haben gewusst, dass Frauen und Kinder dabei gehen. Das ist die Folge, weil wir uns haben verführen lassen.
Nee.
Natürlich ist das die Folge. Hier in Deutschland die Konzentrationslager, dass Warschau kaputt gemacht wurde, wie wir überall, wo man heute hinkam, muss man sich schämen.
Wenn Sie charakterschwache Menschen, die jetzt hier im Raum sitzen, denken sich jetzt, scheiße, ich bin Deutscher, was mache ich denn jetzt? Genau sowas, das machen Sie gerade. Sie verurteilen gerade Menschen, obwohl Sie selber sagten, wir können nichts dafür. Aber gerade wenn wir ein charakterschwacher Mensch sind, Der denkt sich, nein, ich bin Deutscher, ich muss mich schämen mein Leben lang.
Warum zeigst du dich offen dein Gesicht in die Kamera? Warum bist du so feige? Mach deine Zeig, guck in die Kamera und sag deine Meinung. Das tust du nicht.
Mann, sonst wäre ich wieder Straftäter und werde von irgendwelchen
Nein, ich sage, du bist einer von denen. Warum verkleidest du dich?
Weil ich sonst wieder ein Straftäter bin oder sonst was.
Du wirst
sicherlich. Ansonsten ist das garantieren irgendwo ein Straftäter gegen einen anderen Volkskameraden.
Dann müsste ich ja Angst haben, dass ich von Nazis jetzt
Was das denn für ein Blödsinn?
Müsste ich auch haben.
Wenn ich so Angst haben, wenn sie im U-Bahnhof langlaufen, nicht mehr von irgendeinem Albaner abgestochen werden lassen. Davon ist die Angst heraus, nicht von den engen Volksbürgern.
Also ich lege mich auf ein, die müssen wir ja ganz ruhig antworten.
Ja, aber das sind wir doch genauso nicht.
Aber das ist... Ich gehörte einer Mörderorganisation an. Was war es denn sonst anders? Was war das anders? Unschuldige Frauen. Man kann doch der Meinung sein, dass das falsch ist, was wir machen. Das kann ganz falsch sein. Aber man kann doch nicht unschuldige Frauen, weil sie Juden waren oder weil sie Zigeuner waren oder weil sie schwach körperlich gebaut waren, krank waren, haben sie abgespritzt in Euthanasie. Ich kenne bei uns Franz Lemkis, der war so, mit dem haben wir immer unser Spaß gemacht als Junge. Und eines Tages war der verschwunden, dann stellte sich raus, dass sein Landwehr an der Warte eine Spritze gekriegt hat, weg war. Wir haben nämlich gesagt, uns wurde erklärt, unwertes Leben ist zu vernichten. Unwertes Leben. Wir haben das perfekt gemacht, durch Planung, die hier in diese Hause in der Wannsee-Konferenz ausgearbeitet wurde, an einem so einem Tisch, wie wir hier sitzen. In gemütlicher Runde über Kaffee haben sie beschlossen, wie die Juden, Frauen und Kinder umgebracht wurden. Mit dieser scheußlichen Methode, da kann ich doch nicht stolz drauf sein. Da schäme ich mich heute. Und es ist doch nicht selbstverständlich, dass ein Jude mit einem SS-Mann wie mir spricht, der davon überzeugt war, dass es richtig war, was der Adolf gemacht hat. Überlegt doch mal, was das bedeutet. Ich habe mit 23 alten deutschen Juden, die Deutsche waren, die Väter waren zum Teil im Krieg, hat mir eine alte Jüdin über 80 Jahre erzählt. Mein Vater war im Weltkrieg, im ersten, hat Auszeichnung gehabt. Der wollte nicht glauben, dass die Nazis ihn umbringen. Und der hat sich geweigert, aus Deutschland zu flüchten. Das muss man sich alles mal vorstellen, was da passiert ist. Und das, also ich kann es nicht verkraften. Aber ich finde es wichtig, mit jungen Menschen wie euch zu sprechen. Und ich habe nur die Bitte, lasst euch nicht verblenden.
Wow. Watching those clips, I'm sure, brings up many thoughts and reflections for everyone. We're fortunate to have with us 4 panelists who have direct experience through their own lives and through the lives of their families of the Holocaust. Before we actually start talking about the clips and the movie Final Account, I want to give each of them a chance to talk about their own experience, what their experience was with the Holocaust, their experience and their family's experience, the impact that the Holocaust had on them. I'll let them introduce themselves, but you're going to hear from Judy Altman, Andy Sarkini, Marilyn Altman, and Ilan Fogel. So let's first hear from Judy.
Okay, my name is Judith Altman, and I lived in Jasina, Czechoslovakia. In 1939, we were occupied by the Nazis. It was an unbelievable thing. We Jewish children could no longer go to school. Our houses were occupied by Hungarian officers, and we marched to the Polish front. My sister Berta and her family were deported to Poland because she could not have enough proper documents for the Hungarian citizenship. My sister Charlotte and her family were killed by a firing squad in Galicia. My parents' sister Berta and the whole family were killed in Auschwitz. My niece and I survived Mengele selection and Auschwitz-Birkenau in Gelsenkirchen, Essen, and the death march to Bergen-Belsen, where we were liberated by the British in 1945. My father's words were, "Judy, you will live." And these were the words that actually kept me alive. My family lost 22 members in the Holocaust. I had made a promise to tell my story and speak out against hate, discrimination, and indifference, and continue to do so in our school till today. I speak for the last 20 years. Whenever they call, I'm ready to go, because it is so important to tell the world what hate and discrimination can do.
Thank you, Judy.
You're welcome.
Andy.
Good evening. My name is Andy Sarkini. I was born in October 31st of 1936, so I would be qualified as a child survivor. And I lived through Nazi occupation of Hungary, and particularly the Budapest ghetto. My father had a small business in a field of construction, and obviously by early 40s, he had a very difficult time to be able to make a living. And not only he, but practically all Jews. He was most of the time in forced labor camp, and eventually he was deported to Mauthausen, Austria, which is one of the worst death camp after Auschwitz-Birkenau. Thanks God he did survive, but when he came home after the American liberation, I would like to just say that when I found that one out in the building I lived, and I went to see him, I hugged him and kissed him, and I was crying. And when I took 3 steps back, I did not recognize my own father. He may have weighed only 70 pounds. He looked skin and bone. It was really a very devastating sight. It took my mother over a year to trying to nurse him back to life. And during that year, many nights, he was crying, he was screaming. He was reliving the horrors of the death camp of Mauthausen. My personal experience was really in 1943 when I went to first grade. So after my mother enrolled me, a few weeks later, she said, "Andy, you can go to school on your own." It was only about a couple of blocks away where our apartment was. I lived in a very Jewish neighborhood in the 7th district of Budapest. And when I went to school, people knew I am Jewish. They spit on me, called me a dirty Jew. They pushed me to the pavement. I was physically and verbally abused. So after a while, I told my mother, I cannot go to school any longer. I was only a 7-year-old. What did I do wrong? Well, the answer is that I am a Jew. So This is the kind of background I have, and coming to the United States after the Hungarian Revolution 1956, I cherish the freedom which this country provided me. However, unfortunately, the conditions in the United States and in Europe related to anti-Semitism is extremely high level, and it's difficult to cope with it. Of course, education is very, very important. Lastly, I'd just like to tell you that it is important to me to tell my story and hopefully educating youngsters as well as the elderly what really happened during those years under Nazi occupation. There are many, many people in the United States as well as elsewhere who are Holocaust deniers, and we need to fight them. We need to expose them that they are trying to falsify the history. So my purpose is to talk and talk as long as I am able, and to educate everyone who is willing to listen to me. And I thank you.
Thanks, Andy. Marilyn.
Yes, good evening. I first of all just really want to say how honored I am to be on this panel, especially with Judith and with Andy. I'm the daughter of survivors. My parents' experiences were not heavily discussed. I think they didn't want to scare us as children, but we did, as we grew a little older, certainly knew their struggles to get to this country and reinvent themselves. We knew that half of our family, my mother's family, were not there. They were dead because of Nazis. We knew that our father's family, 10 people, 8 kids and 2 parents, my grandparents, miraculously made it to this country in shifts through Finland, London, Italy, and Switzerland. We knew their history was not something out of a book. It was very real and very personal. We heard stories over the years here and there. They came out, one of my uncles being taken by a police officer or military and ordered to scrub the street with lye, which is, I think, the opening of Schindler's List. My father was in the Austrian army until they changed armbands to the swastikas. And he abandoned the army and found a way to get through to Switzerland. He was arrested, sent back, but then he always said he knew how to escape with a few of his brothers. People come through these horrors very differently. My mother, who was a very kind and compassionate person, took her very hidden pain and used it to sensitize me to all of the mistreatment of humankind. She felt that hatred and marginalization was a universal cause. My father who was much more skeptical and nervous about the world outside. He taught us to observe our religion at home, but when we stepped out of our apartment, he urged us to be American. Because of them, as I grew older, I certainly became much more aware, again, of the threats against worldwide Jewry. I realized what a small minority we are in both this country and in the world. Here in the US, we're only about 2 or 2.5% of the population, but unfortunately augur about 60% of all religious hate crimes. My parents made me very aware of how things in a society can change so quickly, and especially in this documentary, that those of you who will see the whole thing will. It is amazing to watch how normal people just became part of this swept up, infectious, murderous group. My parents, I think, being the daughter of a Holocaust people, they always, my mother on one hand certainly made me embrace life, but both of them made me very aware of the enemies around and that you have to know your enemies. I think because of them, I became, as I got older, politically aware, and it drove me towards being in broadcast news as part of keeping an attentive eye on the world. I sometimes now feel that I'm in my parents' times as I've watched the past 20 plus years spike in anti-Semitism here and around the world. I don't think many people realize the amount of security that synagogues have had to go through for the last 25 years. Starting in the mid to late 90s after the first tower attack, we started to see security in synagogues. Once 9/11 hit, from every synagogue in this country to every synagogue around the world, there is major security. Every Saturday when I go to synagogue, there is always police presence, there is always professional security, and I now have joined my volunteer security force, thinking that it is my turn. My parents made me very aware, bless you. Their experiences always have made me question throughout my life. What would I have done? Would I have been brave enough to fight? Would I have survived? And also now today, I question my my commitment to make sure that certainly my community, my people are safe, but also from my mother, that we should always fight the kind of hatred that drove these kinds of actions.
Thanks, Marilyn. Milan.
Hi, good evening, everybody. And as Marilyn said, it really is a privilege to participate tonight. And it's a privilege to be in the presence of both Judy and Andy. So thanks to both of you. I grew up the youngest child of two Shoah survivors. Similar to Judy, my parents were both from Czechoslovakia. Their war experiences were somewhat different for them as individuals, but in terms of the family on both sides, the majority of the family were all killed in Auschwitz was right before Shavuot of 1944. And then my mom's family got there right before Shavuot, and they were killed. And my dad's family got there 3 weeks later to the day, and they were killed. My father was in forced labor camps, as Andy, actually, I think Judith mentioned her father being in forced labor camps. That was sort of the Hungarian model, and Czechoslovakia had been occupied by the Hungarians. My mom was taken to Auschwitz, was separated from her family with her sister and her brother, and went from there to, spend some time there, then was they were sent to Frankfurt to actually help build the runway of Frankfurt Airport for the Messerschmitts, and were then taken to Ravensbrück. And the two fundamental things she said about Ravensbrück were, one, that it made Auschwitz seem like a holiday camp, and two, that up until then, she had been envious of her friends whose parents had been with them, or whose mothers had been with them, because the women were separated. But at Ravensbrück, she was actually grateful that her mother was no longer alive, to suffer with them. And from there, they were taken on a death march. She actually ended up carrying my aunt, who was, I guess, 16. She, on the death march, if you didn't keep walking, then you got shot, and her leg was heavily infected. So, and with that background, what fascinates me most, and what I didn't realize, certainly when I was much younger, was how both of my parents were such incredibly positive people. Positive to us in the family, positive in their outlook to life, very community oriented, and there was never because I've now met so many second generation people who speak about, in our family, there was nothing like, finish your food because we didn't have food when we were little, or there was none of that. There was none of the bitterness. There was very much a looking forward. And I think something that I thought about when Marilyn was speaking, the huge difference today versus then is, of course, the state of Israel. My parents met after the war. My dad had actually escaped and was a decorated soldier, so was given a home, a business, and a car, and but they gave all of that up so as to go to Israel with the founding of the state. They were part of a group that actually helped set up a yeshuv in the new state, which is in existence until today. In 1956, they were sent to South Africa for what should have been 3 years, which became 30 years, and that's where I was born, and hence my accent. My dad definitely expressed a fair amount of survivor guilt, and again, but turned it into something positive. But he did say, why us? Why did, my parents didn't make it, my siblings didn't make it, my friends didn't make it, why me? And so he actually fundraised and built a Yad Vashem memorial in South Africa. And then after 30 years in South Africa, my parents actually moved to Israel. So how this has affected it, Andy mentioned that when he was, because I was thinking how this played out in my life, he mentioned being a first grader and being beaten up by these other kids just because he was a Jew. I've twice gone on March of the Living. And what fascinated me / horrified me was in both times that we were there, we were on these buses, and these Polish kids would come at the sides of the buses and they would do this sort of across their neck, finger across the neck, and they would hiss. They would make the sounds, which was representative of the gas. And it kind of blew me away that these are people who grew up with there weren't any Jews. There are no Jews. And yet that hatred of us just for being who we are has somehow come down a generation, which makes me think of one of the kids in the clip, in the 1C clip, where you see him sort of challenging the guilt that this former SS guard is expressing. So I guess, the one thing I would close with is that, again, I think the huge difference, and I was thinking about when Marilyn was making some of these comparisons, but I think the biggest difference for us today is that we have a state of Israel, and we have a home, and we have the world shut their doors to us. It made it significantly easier for Hitler to do what he wanted to do, and we have the state of Israel, and we have a home. So thank you for the opportunity, and I look forward to further discussion.
Great, thanks, Alon. Thanks all four of you for these reflections on your own experience. I now want to turn to a discussion of the movie, the clips, and I saw that someone asked, so let me first say that the total movie final account is available on Netflix for anybody who wants to see it in totality, and I would recommend that highly. We just saw a few excerpts from it, and the whole movie is very much worth watching. So I'd like to, again, ask each of the panelists, and we'll go in the same order. What was your reaction to the movie? What were your thoughts or your emotions as you watched the movie? And we'll start with you again, Judy.
Well, I'm referring to Evan say in Austria, the female citizen memories of I believe that they didn't lie in the interview, except for one of them, but they confirmed that they knew what was happening. The prisoners were confirmed that they knew what was happening, worked to death, worked very hard, but they didn't tell anyone at that time that they were guests. The House of Wannsee Conference talks to students about the extermination camp of Jews. He told the students that he was sorry he joined Hitler's organization, but blamed Hitler that he was seduced and lost his honor and was ashamed that he had met his Wannsee house in comfort over coffee to plan the final solution of the extermination of the Jews. Who can be called a perpetrator? The interview with Karl Heinz. A perpetrator is a person who carries out harmful, illegal, and immoral acts, and they were all perpetrators. You ask any of the perpetrators, they will tell you that they just followed orders and what they did in a perfect way. Karl Heinz lived an SS, he the king of neighbor who did nothing wrong, just being a Jew was probably enough. He was a prison guard. Herbert Fuchs, an SS lieutenant, why he joined the SS. He was an athlete, and the Nazis lured athletes to join the SS by making it a competitive line for sport games. So everybody had an excuse why they did it, but there were no excuses to what they did. I was in a concentration camp. The SS women were worse than the SS men wherever they can, except one, Fräulein Erika. She was wonderful. I was picked to be sent away back to Auschwitz to go to the gas chamber because I broke my arm and could no longer work. So the next day, there was a transport for all girls that were sick. They couldn't work anymore. They were sent back to Auschwitz. I said goodbye to all my friends and I was ready to go. Middle of the night, somebody taps me on the shoulder. It's SS woman Erika. So I said, ist schon Zeit zu aufstehen? Sagt sie, komm, don't ask questions. She took me to the hospital and they put on a cast on my arm. I told her that I'm going to Auschwitz tomorrow. What do I need a cast? She said, don't ask questions. When we came back to the camp the following morning, they waited for, and I wasn't coming. So she came out and she says, dieses Mädchen geht nicht mit. This girl is not going. I said, what do you mean she isn't going? Because I need her. She is, we worked for Krupp ammunition factory. And they were all Hungarian, Czech, Russian girls and German as well. So they said, why can't she go? Because she speaks all these languages. And if the work has to be done, and they gave it to a Hungarian girl, she tells it to her in Hungarian what she has to do. That saved me. By knowing these languages, I was able to be saved because I did that. So this was my way out of death. Thank you for listening.
Great. Thank you again. Andy, what was your reaction to the movie? Andy, you must be on mute.
I did watch the documentary in full length, and one clip which wasn't shown, I like to just bring to your attention. There was one particular individual was interviewed who very clearly indicated that he very much agreed with Hitler's policies to exterminate all the Jews, and he wanted to make sure that all the Jews would disappear, particularly from Germany. But the general impression I had that, how Judy said, everybody found some excuses, and everybody could have helped at least one person to make their life better. And nobody did. Nobody made any effort. They sort of indicated that we have to follow the rules and we have to follow the orders. Something which also there was no clip, then all these people were practically brainwashed from childhood. The parents got rid of them. They went to schools, they were uniforms, and the teachers were indoctrinated with Hitler's philosophy of racial purification. And so I really feel that all of them are perpetrators. All of them could have done something, and they just stood by and blamed everybody else for their misgivings. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Andy. Marilyn, your thoughts or emotions watching the movie?
Well, very sobering, and actually something that Andy said. I think what struck me was how people that are seemingly normal, and especially when they were younger, these were people that were like teenagers and then ended up getting into the military, but I think it gave me just this interesting view of this whole society. Not everybody was necessarily shooting a gun, but everybody was part and parcel of this hateful philosophy. But how they came to it, especially with schools, especially with the young people. There is in the movie, which I recommend people watch, the girls spoke about how much they loved being in Hitler Youth. They got to do sports, which they were not allowed to do. I mean, isn't that interesting? Goebbels was a mastermind of this. So the girls loved going swimming and playing sports and putting on a uniform. They loved the fanfare. They loved all the flags, the marching. How they captured the imagination of these young people is amazing. With I mean, kids, turned in their parents. But beyond that, there was also segments of these normal people who there was a woman that handled the wages for obviously the non-prisoners. I mean, she did the books. They spoke about concentration camps almost like a camp, that everybody serviced concentration camps. They needed food. They had things delivered. They needed cleaning supplies. They had to have garbage, refuse. I mean, it was just this most interesting, sobering view of how an entire society changed and so quickly, and that these people, yes, they were all perpetrators, but at the time they could disassociate themselves. Do I believe they all knew what was going on? Yes, I do. I mean, you had to be pretty blind, I think. But it was just an interesting view of society. And always, I mean, these things, their society changed within a few years, really, a handful of years. And that was before the internet, before digital, which now is so explosive. I am not on social media, or hardly ever. I hear it is just, a pigsty of what goes on in terms of the world of hate towards Jews, towards Blacks, towards immigrants, refugees, I mean, towards every minority around. And it's why so this stuff is infectious in our society. I think it takes a lot of awareness. It takes a lot of fighting back. And I think it's really inspired me to just really pay attention. We have to pay attention to what's going on individually, but I would say societally, politically, actively, politically. So that's my take. And again, amazing that some people made it out of there, Judith, Andy, but it's horrific when you hear the stories.
Thanks, Marilyn. Alon, your reactions to watching the movie?
I struggled with the movie, but I have very mixed reactions. So, the women at Ebensee, the one said, I wrote down the quote, "Everyone knew, but no one said anything." There's a saying in Hebrew, "Shtika kehoda'ah," like silence is like almost complicity, and that certainly came to mind here. But with one or two exceptions, what I did think was with a few exceptions, what I did think was interesting, and if we look at it sort of from the 30,000-foot view, I think the one thing we can say about Germany is that they have certainly put an effort into reflecting into their past and into what they did. When you think of the collaborators across Europe, and you think of the Ukrainians and the Lithuanians and the Hungarians and et cetera, and the Romanians, and there hasn't been that level of, there hasn't been perhaps any reflection, there hasn't been any acknowledgement of what they did wrong. And if anything, I mean, what we've seen just in the last year or two, it's quite the opposite. There are national efforts to obfuscate what they did, to whitewash what they did, to deny history, to deny their collaboration. So as I said, whereas some of these people sort of really creep me out in how just matter of fact they were about the mass murder of an entire people. At the same time, if you look at the number of people who were interviewed, the majority of them certainly, there was an acknowledgement that what they did was wrong. The other piece that I always think about, and I touched on it when I spoke before, is really honestly the complicity of the world. Because if the world hadn't shut their doors to the Jews, then there wouldn't have been the ability to basically take everybody, ship them off, and kill them. And there too, I think there has not been any admission of, not admission of guilt, acknowledgement of the immorality of their choices. I mean, the British were, the Balfour Declaration had declared where Palestine was supposed to be open to the Jews, and they just went along with everybody else. They shut their borders. The British shut their borders. Spain, Portugal, Switzerland, et cetera, the United States. You had these few countries like Honduras and Cuba who took in some Jews, but the world went along with this. It was very convenient, and I believe that actually at Wannsee, part of the discussion when they did decide to implement the final solution was that, at the beginning there was a little bit of outcry in terms of the world press and the nations of the world, but basically they said amongst themselves, if you look at some of the dialogue, that apparently this is what everybody wants. Nobody wants the Jews, so we're actually doing the world a favor, and I think that's an important thing to remember. Thank you.
Great. Marilyn, I think I saw you raise your hand.
Yes, I was going to say, I ended up going to, the first time I went to Europe was 1968, and the first place I went to was Germany, with a couple of a boyfriend. We were students. We were in college, and to Elon's point, we were meeting with other students in Germany in a couple of cities, and they were incredibly ashamed about what had happened. There was no question about that. What also struck me was I was on a boat ride, a boat on one of the rivers. You know, we were just touring a little, and some of the men started singing songs that were clearly from World War II. And it struck me so deeply that, oh my God, all of these people were Nazis. They were all in the military, and they were singing songs from the military. And yet the youth, as Elon said, you know, tremendous, you know, Germany has done quite a job of, you know, that there are no statues to Hitler. I mean, they don't have, they took a lot of pains in trying to make up for that terrible history. And it was, you know, Berlin until recently was getting tremendous Jewish immigration. And I think it's the last couple of years that has slowed. I mean, it was surprising me to hear it, that, you know, Berlin was again exploding with Jewish life.
Andy?
I just like to bring to your attention today in NBC News, I read that a German lady called Irene Gott, G-U-T, actually saved 12 Jews. She was hiding it in the house where she was a maid. She was a maid to a Nazi soldier. I don't know what rank he was in. And when the Nazis did find out that she is hiding these 12 Jews, and the family of the Jewish family's name is Haller, H-A-L-L-E-R. She offered herself to being the mistress of the Nazi. And that was sort of a payback to the Nazi to not to deport the 12 Jews from the house. So there were not too many, but there were many people, just like Judy mentioned, who provided a safe haven for Jews to either survive or escape. Okay. The other one I like to just mention to you, the complicity of the United States. When the ship St. Louis was coming and actually went to Cuba, and Cuba didn't let them in. And when they were coming toward the United States, and we didn't let them in, and they went back, and everyone who was on that ship, almost everyone, were killed in Auschwitz-Birkenau. So Ilan was talking about, nobody wanted to have the Jews. Now looking at Hungary today, Hungary was probably the most complicit and perpetuate to the Jews, not only in now it's called Slovakia, that part. Everybody spoke Hungarian there practically. If you are looking the border between Hungary and Romania, that part of Romania, everybody spoke Hungarian. That goes back to before First World War. The Hungarians were really very brutal, and they made every effort to persecute the Jews. But going back to the documentary, yes, they all were catered to the needs of the youngsters, to being in camp and doing swimming and all kinds of things, what they could not have done before. And that was part of the brainwashing technique to trying to bring them and their families who may not agree with what's going on. But I still claim that everybody could have done something, and it would not have been that bad. And there were a question came about what Americans did, why the American Air Force couldn't bomb the railroads, could not have done certain things which would have prevented the transfers to Auschwitz-Birkenau, to Mauthausen, to Dachau, Bergen-Belsen. Okay. but this is just true historical facts.
Great. Let me ask you all one more question before we open it up to the rest of the participants for comments. Some of you alluded to this in your comments already. You know, as you think about, you know, the experiences that you and your family had, as you think about what we saw in the documentary, both the full version and in the clips, are there lessons that you can take from your experience and from having watched the documentary about the Holocaust, lessons that you think apply for all of us today, given the challenges that we face here in the United States and in the world? So again, I'll start with Judy and we'll go around to everybody.
Yeah. We have to start with the children way young and try to tell them what they should remember. There is no difference between the color of your face or the color of the other's face. Don't look at it that way. Look at the child, at their ability and what he does. Not about their to discriminate against him for any reason.
Great, thanks. Andy?
The thing
lessons?
The things come to my mind that parents need to be educated so they can educate their children to not to use the word hate. It's so easily used very commonly for all kinds of reasons. And they really don't understand the meaning of that word. And so education is very critical to trying to eliminate the word of hate in any context. And I suggest, and I tell to the students, to replace the word hate with love. Because with love, you can always able to creating an environment of peace, calmity, and endurance, and able to move forward with creative thinking.
Great. Marilyn.
Oh gosh, do I have to follow Andy? He's terrific. Well, it's Allah what my mom certainly passed on, I hope, to me. That it's so important to be compassionate towards others, to treat others as you would yourself. You know, this country, amongst other countries, I mean, the world is having a lot of explosive times right now. Migratory, people are you know, migrating all over the world. And it's, you know, there's a lot of pressure about how people are integrated. And so it requires, I think it first of all requires great parenting. Kids don't know anything unless they are guided. And so parenting, I would say, is so important. And parenting with really open hearts, open minds. And I'm not sure what else I can add to what Andy said. And he would know, he comes a long way. So.
Okay, good enough. Before Alon, just if we're going to open it up to questions from everyone who's out there participating today. If you have a question that you'd like to ask the panel, put it in the Q&A and I'll ask the question on your behalf. But first, Alon, your thoughts about lessons to bring to today?
You know, I mentioned that my parents were these incredibly positive people, and they definitely taught us really a lot of love, compassion, looking at taking the perspective of the other side, you know, looking at how somebody else may experience something rather than the way that you experience it, and so as to get an understanding of how better to embrace them. So the positivity really came from them. I don't want to be the sort of the one negative person here in the group, but what I will say, what has my own life philosophy has really developed beyond that in the context of being very wary of people who hate us. And, you know, if you think about the Iranians talking about wanting to destroy the Jewish state, you know, Hitler put out there what he wanted to do, and he said to do it. And I think we do need to be careful that when messages of hate are around us, that we take them quite seriously and not, oh, well, you know, it's just a phase, it'll go away. You know, it's just, yeah, the world's a little crazy right now. I think when people are hell-bent on hating you, then I think you need to have your antenna up, and you need to take it very seriously, and you need to figure out and have a plan of, you know, of how you're going to deal with it. Marilyn mentioned that she doesn't spend much time on social media, but as you said, social media is a very dangerous place right now. So I think we have a lot of lessons to learn, a lot of good that we can do. In fact, just one other small piece that I forgot to mention before, and it's worth mentioning. When those women in Evansville were talking, at the very end, when they said that when the camp was liberated, they were afraid that the Jews would come, sort of break into their homes and steal and whatever. And they said, but they didn't do that. And so I guess I still do believe that we as a people are an Or LaGoyim. We really are a light to the nations, and we do. I think our sense of morality is where it should be. And so I guess to end off on a positive, I would say that despite being pummeled from every angle, that we should be proud of who we are, and we should continue to do good in the world around us. Thank you.
Great. This one thing I'll add, and then I'm going to go to some questions that I see are coming in. My experience watching the movie was, you know, seeing the complicity and the denial that both in history and even presently for many of the people that were interviewed in the documentary made me think today about, you know, where are we in denial? You know, what don't we pay attention to in terms of what's happening in the world? And how can we open our eyes, every single one of us, more fully to see not only the anti-Semitism, which is obviously still present and in the United States and globally, but all forms of hatred and discrimination and prejudice, and to speak up and take action and not be complicit with it. Okay, so some questions. How much of a representation of German hate do you think, you know, how representative do you think the people in the documentary were of how Germans feel today? Anybody want to take a stab at that one?
Well, I feel that the Germans are quite liberal in a way, and I don't think that they are, I don't know whether they take it, they're more sympathetic toward the Jews, maybe to undo what they did during the war, but I find it that they are much more menschlich coming from the Germans as they used to be. Less anti-Semitic.
Okay, good. Andy, I see your hand. You're on mute, Andy.
I have a very strong opinion. I think the older generation, what we have seen around that age group, all of them are hating the Jews today. They may not admit it, but that's just how I view it. And if you are looking at what's going on in Germany, even though they may try to overcome the Nazi era of Hitler, but the neo-Nazis and their activities in growing in leaps and bounds in Germany, even though you know that the German chancellor is trying to control the country. Just look at what happened when all the Muslims were coming in thousands, and what they were, the government trying to creating some kind of accommodations to them, but what the public were really reacting to it. So I feel when they were a Nazi, it's still a Nazi. There is no change. Maybe the very young generation have learned from history, but looking at back, it's no change.
Okay. Thanks. Another question asks you to imagine you are a 16-year-old in Germany. Your parents are both Nazis. The Nazi youth are prevalent in your school. What do you do? Anyone? Judy?
I had a similar situation. I was speaking in a school and a young girl came over and she says, I have a special problem. What is your problem? And she cried bitterly. She said, my father denies that he was a Nazi. And we know, we tell him, we show him the papers and we tell him that this is not true, but he maintained that he did that. And she said, what can I do? How can I get him to admit that he was a Nazi? So of course, I tried the best thing I would tell him. I told her, try with goodness, try to explain to him. If you will tell them how you really feel, maybe you'll be punished physically, maybe you'll have to pay a fine or something, but get it out and you will feel better and we will achieve something. But I don't know whether it worked because she never came back to tell me.
Okay, very good. Let's do one more question. Do any of you know of anyone who survived being on the marches?
On the March of the Living, March?
No, not the March of the Living, but march, who were marched in the
death marches,
one death camp to another.
I mean, is Judy speaking?
Go ahead, Ilan.
As I said, I have quite a detailed description from my late mom about that death march and about how, first of all, from the very get-go, it was the middle of, it was still winter, it was snow, and she spoke about, and I see this in a lot of the autobiographies of survivors, and as I mentioned to you, I've read a few thousand volumes, but the constant shooting of people who couldn't keep up, and this description of the red blood on the white snow, and the fact that you really didn't have an option. You absolutely, you were not getting food, you were not getting water. I mean, people would take snow and they'd eat grass just to get something into their bellies, and you had to keep going. And in fact, they were marched all the way from Ravensbrück, which is quite near to Berlin. They were marched all the way to the north of Germany, to the very northern border, and then back south. And she said part of it was that there was such chaos at that point that she said the guards didn't even really know where they were going or what they were doing or what the purpose of this. They were really kind of trying to hide the evidence as the Russians came in, as the Americans came in, as the British came in. As I say, how as a somebody who was already completely starved and weighing, I don't know, 70 pounds, how she was able to carry her sister so that she wouldn't be killed. I have no answer for that. But they were, and one morning they woke up and the guards were gone and the Americans came a couple hours later. I see Judy has her hand up.
Yep, but I think we're going to need to close. So I want to thank the panelists and turn it over to Elizabeth for any closing.
Judy, did you want to make a last comment?
No, I just had another that we were marching also to Bergen-Belsen. It took days and days. Half of them were dying on the way from hunger and from no shoes and all that. So it was a terrible way. Only half of it. And those that arrived in Bergen-Belsen, we were sick for weeks and weeks. We could not get to ourselves.
Thank you, Judy. And I'm sorry that we have to end our evening on that note, but I'm really grateful to all the panelists for coming together and sharing their stories and really inspiring and enlightening us. I wish we had more time to discuss this, but I thank all of you in the audience for being here, for your comments, your time, and just listening to all of our panelists today. It's incredible to have them, and I'm so glad that we are recording this so that we can put it out there and make it available for everyone in the community to watch. So it's going to be posted and shared on the Ferguson Library YouTube channel. We will follow up with all of you in the audience with some clips to the documentary, as well as some information about our organizations and future programs. So thank you all and good night.
Thank you so much. Thanks for organizing this.
Thank you very much and have a good evening.
Well done, everyone.